All right, Sony, go ahead, take my money. The Sony ZV-E1 is the company's video creation flagship. In this video, I'm going to tell you why I think that this is the perfect camera for the new YouTube creator or the YouTube creator who's been working with their gear for a while and wants a solution that has so many more features than anything that their current camera has. What kind of features, you ask? That all comes down to artificial intelligence. I hear you saying, wait a second, the Sony a7S III is the company's video flagship, right? Not really anymore. In the same way that when the a7R5 came out with a better autofocus system than the Sony a1, it made the Sony a1 a really clouded and a confusing purchase. Now Sony has taken the same processor that's found in the Sony a7S III and put it inside a body that's smaller than the company's own a7C, and in fact is the smallest full-frame interchangeable lens camera with in-body image stabilization on the market. Now normally at this point what I would do is I'd give you a complete rundown of the camera, my experience with the camera, all the pros and the cons, and I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of that for two reasons. The first reason is that Sony gave this camera to almost every influencer on the planet, and while that's not a problem, it does mean that there's going to be a whole range of opportunity for you to see every spec and every detail on every channel. But what they don't have is the 2 weeks that I spent working with this camera every single day and shooting footage. The second reason that I'm doing this review a little bit differently is because I think that you, if you are a single creator channel like a YouTuber or doing things for social media, you should go out and buy this camera. In fact, I'm going to go out and buy this camera. I don't usually do a full disclosure because I always say what's on my mind, honestly, but in this one I think it's important because I'm making a buying recommendation to people. As a member of the press, Sony sent me this camera for 2 weeks to evaluate. The camera went back to Sony. No money changes hands. Sony doesn't get to see this video before I make it, and probably they don't really care my opinion anyhow. With the Sony a7R5, the company put a brand new AI processing chip on board, and that processing chip gave the a7R5 the ability to do new subject recognition. It could do better face and eye recognition. It could track birds and animals and planes and trains and automobiles. It's a fantastic autofocus system. But at the time I said it was really limited by the fact that they stuck it on a camera with a huge resolution, and the camera's so slow, relatively speaking, that you can't really enjoy the benefits of the AI system. With the ZV-E1 though, Sony has taken those features, put them into this camera with a sensor that is much more applicable for those features, but it's also taken that AI to a whole new level. There are video features in the Sony ZV-E1 that are not in any other video camera on the market, period, full stop. It's also dead simple to use. If you don't want to dig deeply into features, most of the key advances in this camera are controlled by buttons that are on the system, and if you do want to dig deeper, there is a ton of stuff to see in this camera. Let me give you a way to illustrate what I mean. Typically when Sony sends a new camera, we get a spec sheet that's a page or 2 pages long, maybe it's 2.5 pages long. This is the spec sheet for the Sony ZV-E1 that lists all the features. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages long. That is a lot of features. So to talk about the AI features, we have to go back in time a little bit. When Sony was starting in mirrorless full-frame cameras, it got to a point where the autofocus got so good that suddenly everyone realized a full-frame camera could be used as a professional camera. At that point, the competition hadn't even gotten a mirrorless camera to market, and so it seemed really amazing that the Sony camera system could focus so well. Over the next couple of generations of the camera system, Sony kept improving their focus while their competition just got into the market. It gave them several years of advantage. When Sony stuck the AI processor in the a7R5, it was something that none of the other camera companies had done. Since then, a lot of the camera companies have improved their subject recognition. They talk about what they have as being AI too. It puts a lot of stake on the claim that that separate processor gives the cameras tremendous power. Now we're at a point sort of like when autofocus became really good on Sony, where Sony has a feature and the other camera companies are trying to catch up. That was the point at which Sony sort of pivoted, and they went from working primarily on stills cameras and hybrid cameras to hybrid cameras that are mostly video cameras, and now Sony is doing some video first cameras with some stills capability. That's the ZV-E1. What kind of new features? Well, in addition to the product showcase setting that the ZV-1 and the other ZV cameras have, where you can hold a product up in front of the lens and the camera will transition to it, the camera has a feature where if there are multiple people in the frame, if somebody enters the frame, the camera will change the aperture automatically to make sure both people in the frame are in focus. If you've ever done an interview style video, if you've ever done a two-person comparison video where the two of you are talking, you know how difficult this is. Sony is also boasting improvements in their image stabilization based on the AI, and and I gotta tell you, the improvements are really good. In the description, I have a link to a video that I shot completely handheld for a friend of mine who's working on a music video. It's definitely not finished yet, the timing cuts are off, but you can see in it how I use the dynamic and the active image stabilization to take footage that's almost as good as shooting on a gimbal. And if I had taken that footage and brought it into Catalyst Browse, Sony software for doing continual editing and stabilization, it could have taken the gyro data off of the ZV-E1 and made the footage even more stable. Now this is particularly impressive because I shot at 4K 24 to match the rest of my project, which is not a particularly smooth resolution, and yet the footage looks fantastic. There are a couple of shots where I overexposed because I was in manual mode, but when I put the camera in automatic control, not only could it expose properly, but it uses the subject recognition of a human face in order to figure out exposures. Another cool thing it can do with autofocus and the sensor is cropping to keep a subject in center. But it doesn't just do that, it also has the ability to punch in and punch out of the video at intervals, and so while you're shooting your video, you can have a punch in effect and a punch out every 15 or 30 seconds that makes it look like you have a second camera operator. Natively, the camera captures up to 4K 120, but there's going to be an update in June that will give you 4K 240, which is fantastic. If you want to shoot RAW or if you want to shoot 8K, you're straight out of luck on this one. This camera does not have 8K capabilities. That said, I don't know a single channel that's shooting in 8K. There are some bigger studios that use 8K to be able to crop in to 4K or HD. I don't really know anyone doing that, and most of the people I know who are single creator YouTuber channels don't even have the hardware capable of doing it. One of my big problems with the original ZV-1, even though it was a great camera for vlog style video, is that they forgot about the fact that people aren't always in front of the camera. And so the ZV-1 comes with a fantastic noise canceling microphone built into it, but the problem was that it was front facing only. So if you were doing a vlog style video, people could hear you, and then if you turn the camera on and said, and look, there's the Eiffel Tower, it would sound like, there's the Eiffel Tower. Well, the ZV-E1 has fixed that. It still has a 3-capsule noise canceling microphone, but it can be set to detect sound coming from the front, sound coming from the rear, or a balanced mix of the two of them. That's fantastic, and they really listen to people's complaints. Speaking of complaints, and some that Sony did not address, there is only a single card slot in this camera. This will be a deal breaker to many people. For me, I don't consider it a huge issue because while I'm recording in the studio, I'm also recording HDMI output, and so right now I have both the in-camera recording and a secondary recording via my computer. When I'm in the field, I often bring an HDMI recorder with me when I'm shooting. There's really only one other minor quibble, well, two minor quibbles with me with the camera. One of those two quibbles is the fact that the record button is still in kind of a weird place. At least it's kind of in a weird place for when I'm facing it. The button is up a little bit high. That makes it awkward to reach to with your hand, but I know why they did that. Sony has put a brand new control interface on the ZV-E1. It overlays all of the main controls you might need during video shooting onto the screen. Now, you might think, well, we already have the feature menu and we have that new kind of weird quick menu. Why do we need a new interface? One of the things that people love about Canon cameras is that they have the capability on them to touch every single function and change every single function on the touchscreen. Even with the Sony's new menu system found on cameras like the A7R5, not everything on the screen can be touched. With the ZV-E1, all of the controls are touch sensitive. You want to change the exposure compensation, tap and drag. You want to change the aperture, tap the aperture. You want to start and stop recording, you can do that right on the screen. And so I think that Sony figured, well, we've got a button on the screen to start and stop recording. Let's put the record button up somewhere that it's behind and easier to access than the shutter release button for when you're shooting behind the lens. Another minor issue that I have with the camera is that it only has the flip screen. It doesn't have that wonderful new tilty flippy screen that's seen on the A7R5 that allows you to flip it up and flip it out to the side. And in my biggest gripe with the camera, there's only a single dial for changing aperture or shutter speed. There's a back button dial, there's the D-pad, but there's no front finger dial on the camera, which means that when you're shooting in manual mode, you have to use a combination of things in order to change your settings. This, though, I think is why Sony has been putting aperture control rings on almost all of their lenses for the last year or so. Typically, Sony would only have aperture control on their higher-end GM lenses, but even some of the less expensive lenses now have an aperture dial, and it's clickable and declickable. I'm pretty sure that this is Sony's compromise in order to get smaller camera bodies that don't need to be so complex in their engineering. If you can change the aperture with a ring on the front of the camera, you don't really need a dial ring in order to do it. Back to the positives, this camera is a superstar when it comes to formats. It shoots, as I said, in up to 4K 120. There's a new time-lapse mode that actually does the time-lapses in the camera, which is something that people have been asking for forever. And if you don't want it assembled in the camera, the self-timer now lets you set the self-timer and the number of shots. So basically, the self-timer is now in intervalometer. What about the way your images look? Well, ZV-E1 captures almost every log format possible. It's got S-Cinetone, it's got S-Log3, and for people who have have no idea what I just said, there are custom profiles that you can turn on in the camera that give you that cinematic look without having to know what a cinematic look is. Camera recording times are pretty great. They're not as great as the A7S III, which is built-in active cooling, but I did shoot about an hour, a little bit more than an hour of 4K 60 before I realized that I was shooting some footage at a format I didn't intend to be shooting at, and I turned the camera off. Now, if I was smart, I would have kept going to see how long it could last, but I did get an hour of 4K 60 footage out of it, and the camera was barely warm. And basically every other feature that's on every other Sony camera is in the system. If the A7S III has it, it's got this in here. Now Sony has this huge array of cameras that do similar things. You have the tiny ZV-1, you have the APS-C ZV-E10, you have the fixed lens Sony ZV-F, which was a terrible idea, and you have this new ZV-E1. You also, though, have the A7S III, the FX30 that is APS-C, and the FX3 that is essentially an A7S III in a body that looks like a cinema. So what do you do with this many choices? Well, if you're me, you pick the ZV-E1 over all of those other cameras, and here's why. But those cameras don't have the image stabilization of this. They don't have the ability to use AI to track multiple people's faces to keep them in focus. They don't have the ability to crop the frame to the person as they move around the frame. There is a whole generation of functionality in this camera that those cameras do not have. Currently, the A7S III is about $3,300, and this camera is $2,500. And so you get a better camera from a video function and image stabilization standpoint than you do with the A7S III. You don't get 8K, you don't get raw video out over HDMI, and so if you need those two things, that premium is worth it to you. But for just about everybody else, this is a better camera than those two cameras are at a much lower price point. Now back to my original point, I will be buying personally one of these cameras as soon as it goes on available, which will be the day after I am recording this, and I'm looking forward to getting this when it ships in June. And quite honestly, if I could afford two of them, I would buy both of them right now, and I would have one permanently in my studio and one permanently in my bag for doing video out in the field. In addition to the video that I will link to below with the footage from a music video I'm working on with a friend of mine, I also have a video that I will link to that shows off the animal eye detect system using birds and squirrels that came to give me a hand when I feed them daily some walnuts. Even if you don't want to see the autofocus test, some really cute bird. Did I give you enough features to convince you that this is the camera for the YouTube creator? Let me know in the comments below. Do you like the features in here? What does it sound like it's missing? And also, since I'll be getting the camera back to do more videos, what do you want to see me test next? Do you want to see me test specifically the multiple people in the frame? Do you want to see me test the cropping features? What is it on this camera that you would like to see in another video? Let me know in the comments below. If you're a returning video, welcome back. I appreciate you being here. If you're a new viewer, you can hit the subscribe button up there. It really helps the channel keep going. And if you would like to see more of my honest reviews, you can find a playlist of them up there.